Good evening, and thank you so much for being with us. Tonight we will witness and participate in a timely and important discussion with Brad Smith, President of Microsoft, and Ina Fried, Chief Technology Correspondent at Axios. How can the hopes technology offers be protected against the very real threats that it also presents? The genesis of this conversation is Brad's acclaimed new book entitled Tools and Weapons, The Promise and the Peril of the Digital Age. Hot off the presses last week. Brad and Ina, welcome. We're privileged to have Brad with us this week, especially after welcoming his close associate, John W. Thompson, Microsoft Chairman of the Board, to our stage last Thursday. A big thank you to our program partner, Microsoft, especially Luis Montero and Maddie Orser. Microsoft has generously contributed a copy for each of you of Brad's new book as a special gift. We appreciate that very much. And if you did not receive your copy, you can pick it up at the registration table after the program. And by the way, Brad's co-author, Carol Ann Brown, is also with us tonight. Welcome. We're very pleased to co-host this program with the Computer History Museum, also known as CHM. Before coming to Churchill Club 12 years ago, some of you know that I was the first president of the Computer History Museum. And around that time, CHM's current president and CEO, Daniel Lewin, was corporate vice president at Microsoft, a very strong supporter of CHM, and also a board member at Churchill Club. Our two organizations have been operating in a similar orbit for decades, and although this is certainly not our first collaboration, it's always very powerful when we can stand together as we are for this tonight. You'll hear more about CHM in a moment. Meanwhile, I'm pleased to say a few things about Churchill Club. Founded in 1985 and kicking off with then Intel CEO Bob Noyce as our first speaker. Today we are the premier independent thought leadership forum devoted to strengthening innovation, economic growth, and societal benefit. Our nonprofit aim is to look for what's new, next, not widely known, so that instead of unpacking trends or looking at them under a microscope, we are looking at their implications for the times ahead, particularly if they're under-discussed and something new to talk about. So we convene about 24 programs every year for the vibrant, dynamic workforce that is supporting the innovation economy. So let me now invite CHM President and CEO, Daniel Lewin, to the stage. Welcome, Daniel.
Well, thank you, Karen, and thank you for those kind remarks. This is a special night for various reasons for all of you, because I know what you're in for if you haven't read the book, but you soon will, and you'll certainly enjoy the program. But I get to say a few things up front. Number one, the Churchill Club was incorporated and written up by Rich Karlgaard and two other people, Bob Latta and Rick DeGolia, in the house next door to my house about 30-some years ago back then. So I've always had a special spot for the Churchill Club, and thank you, Karen, for those kind remarks. I was on the board for 10 years and really enjoyed it, and was chairman with Karen a long time ago. It's a special night for me for a couple of other reasons. The first I would like to say is that I spent 17 years at Microsoft. In my last 5, I worked for Brad. And I got to know a lot about global issues and strategic issues from participating on his staff. The insight and sort of depth of knowledge on a broad set of topics is just astounding. In my new role at the Computer History Museum, and as Karen said, CHM, we're taking a new lens on the world. We'll continue to maintain the definitive collection of artifacts and oral histories in the industry, but we're bubbling up a little bit, as Karen said, relative to CHM, and the framing you'll soon see on our website within the end of this month is associated with this lens, which is computing, humanity, and meaning. And then the question is, what does it mean to be a human in a world of computing? Because life, as we all know it, especially in this town, life doesn't exist without computing. And I think Brad's framing and the conversation you'll hear today is indicative of so many of the topics that are addressing us on a global scale. That's really exciting. And for those who remember the days of Windows 3.0, I'm the third person to run the museum, so we're calling this CHM 3.0. And everybody knows that it wasn't without the networking extensions, 3.1, that Windows didn't really take off. And so we're partnering a lot. We're going to be partnering with more over time. But thank you, Churchill Club, for this partnership tonight. And thank Microsoft, obviously, for bringing Brad here and helping with the program. The last thing I want to say before we move on is a story about Brad that I think is indicative of what you'll experience here. My last division, I lived in a division for a long time at Microsoft, was hired by then Steve Ballmer in the beginning, but then worked in Satya's division before he became the CEO. And Brad came to me before that happened and said there might be some interesting things going on that you might be uniquely positioned to help us with, and maybe you could come to work for me. So when Satya became the CEO, I went to work for Brad. And at the exec retreat, which the company holds once a year for 3 full days of the executive staff, of which there are about 100 plus people. There are some talks that are given by the most senior executives, of which Brad is clearly one. And invariably, they're engineering talks, because the company's run mostly by engineers. At the end of the retreat, Satya's first retreat as CEO, when he stood up and summarized the meeting, he said, "Isn't it fascinating that the most technical talk that occurred over the course of these last 3 days came from our general counsel?" And it was about the technique of telling the story that motivated people to think differently and to behave accordingly. And in this case, it motivated the engineering organization to do what they're doing today, which is to build the products and services that make the most valuable company in the world stand alone. So with that, let me introduce Brad and Ina and let them get on the stage and get going. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks, Brad, for doing this. You know, we're in such an interesting time for technology, and there's actually no one I'd rather hear their thoughts on all the different issues confronting the technology, because no one's been thinking about it for as long as a company as Microsoft, and you in particular. Since Daniel started off by telling stories, when I first read the book a couple months ago, I said, you know, I expected all the good thoughts. I expected the ideas. I didn't expect that you'd actually tell good stories as a lawyer. So I think some of the credit, I'm sure, goes to Carol. But for each of these issues that's coming up, you have a very human story. And one of the ones that interested me maybe to start with is this meeting that you and some of the other tech leaders had in the Roosevelt Room with President Obama. Set the scene for us. Why were you there, and what was one of the things that came out of that?
Sure. Well, first of all, let me just say thank you to everybody. It's, you know, just not just a pleasure, but it's an honor to be in a room with so many people who do play and have played such an important role for technology and for our industry, and of course be here with Karen and Daniel and with you. Carol Ann and I really did have this interesting conversation. You know, what were the big inflection points for technology this decade? And I think one of the big inflection points in terms of the relationship between the tech sector and the government was clearly the year 2013 in the wake of the Snowden disclosures. So one of the stories we share is a meeting that took place in the Roosevelt Room at the White House in December of 2013. And by any measure, it was a pretty extraordinary meeting. There were about 14 or 15 tech leaders, household names, faces that everyone, not just in this room, but frankly, in most of the world would recognize. And you know, there was President Obama and Vice President Biden and really the whole senior staff of the White House, decked out as, you know, frankly, only the White House can be a week before the holidays, you know, with its festive best. And the goal of the meeting was really to talk about the issues that the Snowden disclosures had brought to light. When Barack Obama was president, there was a particular routine for these meetings. People were all given the opportunity to sort of go around the table offer a few talking points, if you will. You know, in a way, it could get, if not done well, pretty boring. And one of the things that was always amazing to me in these settings was President Obama, and it's where I was often reminded of the fact that, you know, he was a former law professor. You know, he had Socratic reasoning and this ability to turn talking points into a conversation in a way that few people could. And as the conversation went around the table, with only perhaps 2 exceptions, everybody was pushing the president to put in place more checks and balances for the NSA. That was the issue of the day. And there was this very interesting particular moment when President Obama sort of leaned back and then he sort of pushed back. And he did it in a very reflective way. He said, I have a suspicion that the guns will turn. If you look around this table, so many of you and your companies have more data than the government about the people of this country. And you should think about what you're asking, because there will come a day when the same demands will be placed on you. I thought it was a very interesting moment. That's why I wrote it down and remembered it 5 or 6 years later when we were working on the book. And I think it's so interesting because when people look back at this decade from 2010 to 2020, I think that they'll probably say, in terms of the relationships between tech and the government, there were these 2 inflection points. The first was 2013, it was Snowden. The second was 2018, Cambridge Analytica. And Cambridge Analytica, I would say, was the moment when President Obama's prediction came true.
So I want to get in, obviously, to all of that, but maybe to start it off from where we are in a moment in time. You know, obviously things have shifted, a lot of attention. The guns have turned. There was an article, opinion piece in the New York Times this week saying there is no tech lash. And the point wasn't that there's plenty to keep you busy. There's all these proposed legislation, which we'll talk about. But the point was, for the consumer, the love affair with tech hasn't really changed. And I'm curious what your thoughts are. Is there a tech lash beyond DC and, you know, the sort of attorneys general?
This, to me, is such a fascinating question because there's 2 very different ways to look at exactly the same thing. One is to say, look, consumers are not changing their behavior. They're not dropping or reducing their use of social media or these devices. If anything, they're using them more than ever before. And the other is to say, well, wait a second, you know, why all the pressure then from governments? Is this government disconnected from the public, or is it government representing the public? I actually think it is government representing the public. Myself, I mean, look, I'm just one person, but I think what people are saying is, we don't want to give up these devices. We don't want to give up these services. They are too indispensable for our lives. We value them. But we do want to see our privacy protected, and we do want to see these other issues addressed without our giving them up. How do we do that? Well, that's called government. And one of the things we do throughout the book is try to apply some insights that we see, at least from history. There's an adage, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does often rhyme. And in the chapter on social media, one of the things we talk about is something that happened in 1946. It was called the Revolt Against Radio. And what you really see is that the first radio broadcast in the United States was in 1920. It broadcast the presidential election results, where Warren Harding won and succeeded Woodrow Wilson. Throughout the 20s, a radio was like magic. People could bring this box into their home, and through it they would bring the world into their home. Oh, their horizons shifted. They heard people's voices. They were entertained in new ways. Everyone loved radio. But by 1946, there was a backlash, and there's some interesting insights into the nature of it, but for this purpose, just say the public was concerned about the impact of radio, the impact on their families, kids being distracted, programming they thought was increasingly banal, the role of advertising. And what you see is that that was year 26 of radio. Now, then if you look at the history of television, what you see is that started to be broadcast into people's homes first around 1950. And what you see in the mid-70s is a similar sort of concern, backlash from the public about television programming and the like. And I think there's a sound thesis that as you get into the middle of the third decade of a ubiquitous technology, there is almost a natural level of concern. The people are no longer saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe that I can find my friends on Facebook. We take it for granted. And you see the broader impact, public reaction kicks in, and then government starts to kick in. And when you think about it in those terms, I think one could say the internet really exploded for the first time in 1995. That was Netscape. It was Microsoft's response with Internet Explorer. Well, if you take 1995 as the start date, what is the year 2020? It's year 25. So we are seeing, I think, a real rhyme repeat itself.
So one of the things we've obviously seen is a clamoring for legislation, sometimes specific and sometimes, we get, and we've heard this from some of the 2020 candidates, just break them all up or, pretty vague. And one of the things I appreciate about you is, my guess is you're not, legislation is good, legislation is bad. So I want to divide it into the different areas because there's not one way to have legislation. One is obviously kind of first and foremost, I think in people's mind, is the privacy side of things. And, we're starting to have this debate. For me, I feel like I always said, privacy is one of these things. It flares up, people get all worked up, Congress says they're going to hold hearings, and by the time those hearings happen, everyone's forgotten about it. The wake of Cambridge Analytica is the first time I think we've really had a sustained dialogue. The companies may have had, Microsoft had a thoughtful, long dialogue about privacy, but as a country, and I'm curious, where do you think privacy, where is the right role for legislation? Is GDPR style just telling you what all the companies know? Is that sufficient? Is it too much?
Well, the first thing I would say is I think we've gone through 2 waves of privacy protection on a global basis, and we're soon going to find ourselves grappling with what we call the third wave. The first wave came in the 1990s from Europe, and the basic concept was very simple. Before a company could start using people's data, they had to give people notice and get their consent. Great concept. Of course, what quickly happened is the internet exploded and everybody got inundated with privacy notices, and people went, oh, I don't have time to read that stuff. Let me just click accept so I can go do what I want to do. I think that in part gave birth to what became the second wave of privacy protection, which is the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. And as I try to think about it, I think the basic concept there was people didn't have enough time to read the notices, so let's give people the ability to go see what data exists about them. Let's require every company that has data to make that data available to consumers, and then let consumers look at it, change it, delete it, move it, etc. Now, it turns out that the second wave, I think, is also a very good concept. It complemented the first. But I think people are rapidly going to discover, especially in Europe, that the second wave suffers from the same challenges as the first. We have so much digital data. The next decade, next year, will begin with 25 times as much digital data on the planet as existed in the year 2010. Guess what? People don't really have that much time to go looking at or for all their data. And I think over the next decade, we'll probably see, therefore, a third wave that will be more rules-based. And people will like it, people will hate it. It depends on where people are coming from. But I think it is almost inevitable that you will see, perhaps especially in Europe, more of a focus on specific regulatory rules that seek to put certain uses of data either in bounds or out of bounds.
I mean, it seems to me there's 2 problems, and you identified one with sort of just telling you all the data that's collected. One, it's an increasing volume, maybe three problems. One, it's a tremendous volume. Two, it's increasingly not going to be human intelligible. It's going to be an amount of data and a type of data that only other machines can understand. And then, to me, there's also this third problem that was illustrated by Cambridge Analytica, and I'm curious what you think of it. It wasn't, if you told most people what data Cambridge Analytica had gotten their hands on, never mind that they might never have had the right, it was pretty mundane stuff. It was your personality, it was these quizzes. What was powerful was what they were able to infer based on the data. So it wasn't the data that they were collecting, it was just how powerful it is. Are we having a sophisticated enough conversation around data to really understand the power that any big company has with the amount of data? If Microsoft, for example, wanted to infer based on the data it has, it could know a lot.
I think there's two things to think about, Ina. I mean, the first is sort of, why was Cambridge Analytica an inflection point? It's not like it was the first data breach in people's minds. It wasn't even necessarily the biggest data breach. I think part of it is what you described. It was drawing inferences, but I think it was also another point. People's data was used to advance a political campaign of a candidate that they didn't necessarily support. And that bothered people. And then, of course, because it was a political campaign, it especially resonated in the political capitals of the United States, including Washington, D.C. By definition, politicians got more involved. Now, what I think is, to me, incredibly interesting about what happened over the course of 2018 in very short order is what happened here in California. And one of the more interesting stories, at least to us, was the set of stories we tell in the chapter on consumer privacy, which has got a little bit about Microsoft, but it's much more about other things. And one of the stories that will be, of course, familiar to many people in this room is the story of Alastair McTaggart.
How many people actually know this story? Because I actually think very few know this story. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Alastair lives up the highway in San Francisco and the East Bay and the like. He's a real estate developer. And we share the story of how Alastair had people over for dinner, a barbecue, and there was an engineer from Google. And he asked the engineer, well, how much information does Google have about me? And the engineer said, if you knew how much data we had about you, you would be terrified. And I'm not trying to endorse that person's view, I'm just the reporter here. But that started Alastair, who's a really grounded, thoughtful guy with certain financial resources as a successful real estate developer, on a quest, a cause, if you will. He said, I'm going to change this. I'm going to get privacy protected. And as a real estate developer, he actually understood and understands a lot about politics, because, of course, you can't do real estate without figuring out how to work with municipalities and the like. And he happened upon an aspect that is of fundamental importance politically in the United States. At a time when there is gridlock in Washington, D.C., even arguably gridlock in many state capitals, he realized that because he lived in California, he didn't have to get a vote of the legislature to enact a new law. He simply had to get it on the ballot and adopted in an initiative. So he spent $3.5 million of his own money. He had signature gatherers, lawyers, lobbyists. They collected more than twice as many signatures to put this on the ballot. It would have gone on the ballot in November of last year. He did polling. One of the most interesting things for anybody who comes from the world of politics is to talk to Alastair about it, the polling. Because the polling showed that more than 80% of the California voters would vote in favor of his privacy initiative. And as he says, he was disappointed. He's like, what's wrong with the other 20%? And his pollster said, you don't get it. We've never seen numbers this high. And of course, what that set in motion, as some people here may remember, was about a year ago, a pretty ferocious effort. Was Silicon Valley going to raise enough money to defeat this on the ballot? It would have taken tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars at a minimum to defeat it. Was Alastair prepared to spend what it would take to pass it? And ultimately, it did what nothing else, I think, ever would have done. It moved the issue then to Sacramento, where Alastair, and he had some supporters in the state legislature, said, yeah, we'll pass this as a bill. There were some from the industry, including our team at Microsoft, that said, hey, we'd work with you, see if we could find a bill, so that if it was passed, then he would withdraw the initiative. And of course, at the last hour, basically of the last day, the California Consumer Privacy Act was adopted. And it became, overnight, far and away, the most sweeping piece of privacy legislation in the history of the United States. And it was remarkable for that reason, and I think it is continuing to ripple across the country in ways that have just, now people are beginning to appreciate just how profoundly it changed the landscape for privacy protection, not just in California, but nationally.
So 2 quick follow-ups on that, and then I want to move to another area of policy, which is antitrust, which you have some experience with. But while we're talking privacy, and the California bill in particular, given that, this impetus of this California bill, the main provisions of it don't take effect till 2020, and so a lot of people thought, we don't want 50 state laws. This would be the impetus, even in a divided Congress that doesn't pass a lot, for a national privacy law. You have privacy groups calling for it. You have a significant amount of the tech industry calling for it. We haven't seen a lot of movement. Since you already took the role of journalist, how about the role of odds makers? What are the chances we get national privacy legislation before the California bill goes into effect?
Let me say something that I think is both true and provocative. There already is a de facto national privacy law in the United States. It is the California law. Because 1 of every 8 Americans lives in California, every tech company in the nation is going to have to answer the same question by the 1st of January. Do we offer one set of privacy rights to people in California and a different set of privacy rights to people in the other 49 states? Or do we offer the same set of privacy rights to everybody nationwide? This is where I'll place odds. I'll place odds that most companies will just take a single nationwide approach. Because one of the things we describe in a little bit of detail in the chapter in the book is, given the nature of what are fundamentally the European rights that are now enacted in California, giving consumers the right to access their data, you have to create business processes, you have to support it with engineering automation. And I just don't think that most companies are going to decide that they want to have 2 different business processes, 2 different types of engineering automation. If it were like North Dakota and 49 states, that would be different. With it California and 49 states, I don't think it will.
And we've seen that with GDPR.
Exactly.
A lot of companies have, even some that fought GDPR have now said, we're going to extend those protections to all our consumers, in large part because once you do it, you have to have a business that works in that environment.
Yeah, and we will see other states move forward with legislation, including Washington State. I think we'll see another debate in Washington in 2020. And people will worry about conflicting laws. It's why I gave a speech in 2005 in Washington, D.C., saying, let's adopt a national law, let's do it before there's this patchwork of laws. It was obviously very impactful, as you can all see. Nothing happened. But everybody will debate in Washington in 2020, 2021, will we have a national law? And maybe someday we will have a national law. Given the size of the California congressional delegation in the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives, I don't think you'll see in the foreseeable future any real consideration for national privacy legislation that is weaker than what is in California. So we could end up with a national privacy law that more or less formalizes what exists in California, or we could end up with gridlock and nothing, in which case, informally, I think California's law will be the law that's pretty much adopted across the country.
So if there are any government relations people, what you just heard from Brad is basically stop lobbying in DC. If you want a law passed, just put it on the ballot in Sacramento. So I want to move on to antitrust, another big area of where we could see regulation. As I mentioned, for some of the younger folks, Brad actually did have some experience with antitrust. How do you see the competitive landscape? Are there significant antitrust issues in tech? I mean, we have Elizabeth Warren and others saying break them up. Is that really a significant problem right now?
Well, I mean, first, just to provide a bit of context for those of you who don't know or don't recall, yeah, I'm definitely a graduate of the School of Hard Knocks because I was at Microsoft, starting in 1993, and therefore lived through the climatic antitrust years that included the Department of Justice in 20 states working together and literally at one point obtaining a court order to break Microsoft up. And so, the first thing I would say is, when you're in the tech sector, you don't actually get to be the one who decides whether there's an antitrust issue. It is the antitrust officials in the FTC and the DOJ that make that decision. It is members of the Senate and House on the judiciary committees that decide whether there is an issue. And it's the state AGs who decide whether there is an issue.
You get to have opinions. In fact,
Yeah.
sometimes the
So-
DOJ sends out letters asking for your opinion.
Yeah, I mean, look, I guess you'd have to say there appears to be an issue. Read the news. So you sort of have to look at it and ask, well, what's going on and what do you make of it? In the Microsoft Windows era, happily Windows is still a product, but it's obviously not in the position it was in the marketplace, say 20 years ago. People were very focused on the pretty extraordinary market position of a single platform. And I think what we live with today is a little bit different. We actually live in a world with multiple platforms. That's why the Judiciary Committee in the House sent out subpoenas seeking every email from 4 companies. So we all know we have multiple platforms. And at one level, I think you could look at it and say, hey, a world with multiple platforms, by definition, is more competitive than a world where everybody is focused on one. And that's an argument for saying the current climate actually is more competitive than it was 20 years ago. Now, the other side of that coin, at least as I think it is being increasingly perceived by people in the competition law field, whether in the United States or Europe, is that the platforms are somewhat different today than they were 20 years ago. We at Microsoft were never smart enough to think of a thing called an app store. So anybody could always put any app that they wanted onto Windows. It didn't mean there weren't antitrust issues, because if we integrated a browser into Windows, that had an impact on Netscape, for example. But you didn't have this control of literally what showed up on the device the way you do today. I think the other thing that you have is this notion of what's now increasingly called platforms and aggregators. I think Ben Thompson has captured this the best in his newsletter Strategery, and these two-sided markets. So there's a lot more complexity, and I think this will probably keep a lot of people busy and probably pay for another generation of kids to go to college for all the people who will be employed as lawyers and lobbyists and communications professionals for several years.
Since you do have this experience and have been through it, do people in the industry, some of these other platforms, do they come to you and ask for your advice? Do you give advice regularly to some of the other folks finding themselves under the microscope?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, I don't presume to have the answers for everybody on everything, but whenever people ask, I'm always happy to share what we learned.
And the other thing that's interesting, obviously it's been a really, fairly long time now since the DOJ and Microsoft, and one of the things that always struck me was, having covered Microsoft, I covered it for CNET for a decade, including during this time, the impact didn't seem to be the decisions that was reached. The consent decree didn't impose terms that were so onerous that kept Microsoft from doing business. But I do wonder, with a little bit of time to reflect, do you think it fundamentally changed Microsoft in ways that hindered it from being as creative and competitive as it need to be. In the specific example I use, there was a period of time where at the same time, Microsoft, to ship a computer in Europe, had to offer a screen with all the rival browsers out there. Microsoft couldn't bundle all the different elements that it wanted to, and yet you had Apple putting out a device around the same time, 2006, that had one browser, one app store that they fully controlled, as you mentioned it, as well as a camera and a bunch of other sensors. Microsoft could never have responded at that time in kind. What do you think the lasting, perhaps unintended effects can be of a company learning the lessons that Microsoft learned?
There's a lot that I think people can learn from our mistakes, our travails. I think the first thing one can reflect upon, and we included in one of the endnotes in the introductory chapter, where we tried to include a lot of stories in the endnotes. Once an antitrust investigation takes off, it tends to last a really long time. Actually, the whole Microsoft episode lasted 29 years, which probably you'd go, you got to be kidding me. I didn't realize that. The first investigation started in 1990. The last case ended in 2018. And that means it was a good deal shorter than the issues for AT&T or IBM. So you have this, that's almost the norm, how long these things unfold, especially today when they become global. There was an aspect that is painful. To me, one of the challenges in this space is, as so many of you know, when you found a company, you pour yourself into it, or it probably doesn't do that well. You're enormously proud of it. You're proud not just of the business success, but for most people, you're proud of what you're doing for the world. And then suddenly you have this day where you have government officials or journalists or others saying, well, you may be proud of yourself, but you shouldn't be. And you learn that you suddenly have to look at yourself in the mirror and see not the person you've been looking at and saying, oh, don't I look good? And instead start to understand what the rest of the world is seeing in you. And that requires a real shift. And that, Bill Gates talks a little bit about this shift even in the foreword. I think there is a lesson in terms of the impact of the remedies that were imposed on Microsoft. It certainly sought to open the door for other categories of software, including some categories that reshaped the industry, like the browser. But I also just think that one of our directors in about 2005, to me, made one of the more profound statements. He talked about the opportunity cost of fighting these fights. Every hour you spend doing one thing is an hour you don't spend doing something else. That's sort of like the laws of physics somewhere. If you have to spend a lot of time dealing with an antitrust issue, it will mean that there is a lot of time that you are not spending on other things. And you can't possibly know in advance what those other things would be. It's only a decade later when you see the parts of technology that maybe passed you by. And you can ask yourself, what if? What if I wasn't spending all that time in a deposition or getting ready for it or dealing with the controversy around this? Would I have recognized this other shift? Would I have done a better job of jumping on it? And of course, it's one of life's great imponderables, because you can't actually know if you would have spotted the other thing if you had been spending your time looking in that other direction. But I will say that the opportunity cost associated with these issues is so substantial that, in my mind at least, as someone who lived through it and experienced it, provides one of the strongest reasons for people to find, at least if it's possible, a path that involves an element of compromise, even for people who don't really like to compromise in their lives.
And you were one of the chief voices for compromise at a time. Your predecessor, I don't recall being as compromise-minded. Anyway, I'd love to talk more about antitrust, but I want to hit on AI and face recognition in China and get time for people's questions. One other area of legislation is around not just facial recognition, but the use and the government use and the civil liberties implications of these advanced technologies. And there's been a lot of talk about what tech companies should and shouldn't sell to governments. And Microsoft, and you in particular, came out pretty early and said, this is an area we need legislation. Why can't the tech companies, you guys develop it, there's a lot of sentiment, especially here in Silicon Valley, that it's the companies that need to decide what the right technology is, not the governments. But Microsoft's saying, we need national legislation that says what governments can and can't do with, in specific, facial recognition.
Yeah, no, there's lots of reasons that we think that there needs to be law and rules and regulation around facial recognition. Part of it is we see it as a technology that has enormous promise and benefit, but it has real risks. There's risks around bias and discrimination, especially for women and people of color. There are real questions, and even I would argue risks around our personal privacy in the commercial setting. If we can be followed into every store throughout a shopping mall, and the data can be used in ways that we don't even appreciate. And I think most fundamentally, there are real risks for fundamental democratic principles. I think it's interesting. It was last year, 14 months ago, we said, gee, we think there's real thought that needs to be given to how an authoritarian regime or any government that doesn't have protections in place could use facial recognition to chill the opportunity for people to protest in a square. All you have to do is look at Hong Kong over the last few weeks. And people are wearing masks not just because they are thinking about tear gas. One of the first things that some of the protesters tore down were the cameras. So I think these are real issues, and they deserve our thought, and they even deserve urgent action. And I would say at the level of principle, look, if there's one of the principles that I think is just fundamental to this country, it's that no one's above the law. No person's above the law, no government's above the law. Well, if you really believe then that it's not altogether radical to suggest that no company or product is above the law either, especially when it has both potential and risks. And we worry about a race to the bottom. We all recognize that facial recognition, like almost any AI-based service, is very data intensive. It creates a natural market incentive for a company to do everything it can, sell it to anybody who will buy it, get all the data as fast as possible, use that to become the market leader, and thereby surpass everybody else. But that is a recipe for sacrificing a more responsible approach on all three of those issues. So if we want to avoid a race to the bottom, you need a floor, and the floor typically is the law or regulation.
One of the other areas where I think society is trying to grapple with who should set the rules and how should they be set is around content moderation. And you found yourself in an interesting position. So first I want you to tell the story, and then I want to get some of your thoughts. So Christchurch became a turning point that I don't think most Americans realize of the tech industry coming together with governments and really taking a look at this. First, take a step back. What happened and why were you in the center of it?
Yeah, I ended up together, actually by coincidence, Carol Ann, my co-author, and I, we worked on my external work together. We were in Wellington, the capital of New Zealand, about 12 days after the Christchurch terrorist attack. And I think the first reaction for many Americans is, unfortunately, unhappily, to say, well, what was so remarkable about March 15th in Christchurch? I mean, we've lived through days where we've seen attacks, mass shootings in synagogues and churches and schools and now stores. What was it about the Christchurch attack that was different? And the thing that was different, and it was captured by Kevin Roose, I thought very eloquently in the New York Times, it was the world's first internet staged mass shooting. It was live on Facebook, on 8chan, Twitter, in a way that you could argue that it was a terrorist act that didn't just use the internet as the stage, but you could even say that the ability to use the internet as a stage might have created an incentive for the attack in the first place. So Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, after she first went to Christchurch, and we all saw these incredibly poignant images around the world of her connection with the survivors and family members in Christchurch, had some strong words for the tech sector. And she basically said, look, these days of just putting content up on social media and the web without any responsibility for what's there have to end. We were not, as a company, in the center of this, but it would also be wrong for us to say that we were immune from it, because we have 9 different services, including LinkedIn and Xbox Live and a variety of others that can be, and in fact, to a limited degree, were used to share the content from that day. And so I found myself starting this day in Wellington on Radio New Zealand, just being sort of raked over the coals in a 10-minute live interview that lasted for a half hour, where I think half the listeners in New Zealand probably thought I worked for Facebook, given the nature of the questions. But Prime Minister Ardern asked to meet later that day. We went to this meeting with her. We had no idea what to expect. Walked into her office. A substantial percentage of her cabinet was there. And her basic question was, look, what can we do to try to reduce the prospect of this happening again? I'm not interested in scoring PR points. I'm interested in some real change. And that did lead to a conversation that set us on a path with, in my view, extraordinary leadership by the New Zealand government and its foreign ministry, a really positive effort by Twitter and Facebook and Google and Amazon and those of us at Microsoft to come together. And on the 15th of May, 2 months later, to the day, there we were in Paris at the Elysee with President Macron, Prime Minister Ardern, heads of state from 10 different governments, 9 tech companies, signing what is now known as the Christchurch Call to Action. And we are taking real steps as an industry in collaboration with governments to impose limitations and protections around live streaming, to work together to improve technology and put better controls in place about uploading of this kind of content, to advance R&D and share it in an open source manner and take other steps. So I think it's one of the more important technology policy developments of 2019. And when people look back at it a decade from now, they will see many things that will reverberate throughout the 2020s that are reflected in this effort.
I want to move on to China and AI, but I do want to ask one question. We saw this incredible coming together of governments and tech in the wake of Christchurch. The US was not one of those governments you mentioned, and the US has not signed on to that call. The US and the tech companies work together to fight Islamist terrorism, and it's incredible how little spread of that you find and the degree of effectiveness there's been. Do you think a large reason that we aren't seeing the same crackdown and ability to stop the spread of white supremacist content online is a lack of will from this government?
No. Actually, I don't think that's the reason. We talk in the book repeatedly about the need to solve the technology issues of our day by building coalitions of the willing, and particularly multi-stakeholder coalitions that bring together governments, tech companies, and nonprofits across civil society. We are unabashed advocates for multilateralism at a time when the headwinds to multilateralism are pretty substantial. This is a time when governments are pulling inward. It's a time full of headlines about governments, especially perhaps our own, pulling away from prior trade agreements, from not being supportive of multilateral initiatives. And I think that's the underlying issue that we've had to grapple with for both the Christchurch call and last year's Paris call for cybersecurity. But I will say this as well, and we say it in the stories throughout the book. If you are determined, if you can build a coalition of the willing, if you can establish strong principles, whether it's digital safety or cybersecurity or privacy or anything else, you can establish a new pillar. You can make it strong, and you can continue to attract more people to support it over time. So I always say, never worry about the people who have signed on. They just haven't signed on yet. And I actually am a big believer that we are going to make more progress. You're going to see in New York, a week from today at the UN General Assembly, you're going to see more governments signing on to the Christchurch call. You're going to hear about more involvement and more involvement even from our own government.
Is the U.S. government going to sign on?
I don't think they'll sign on a week from now, but they're engaging. And it's like anything in life, you just have to, if you constantly move forward, if you constantly make progress, and you constantly use that as the opportunity to take the next step, that's how you really pursue lasting change, whether it's the world of business or anything else. And so I have dealt enough with people in this administration to feel that this for them is a question of the role of multilateralism and to some degree the First Amendment, which is always a complicating factor for any US government effort involving content. But I believe that we are going to make progress.
All right. Well, on China, turning to another topic that comes up all the time, I want to start from a different place. There's a whole chapter in the book on China. A lot of the discussion around US-China focuses on the here and now, and I actually want to start by taking a step back. You have these two giant powers in technology, both of whom are highly dependent on one another, both of whom seem to aspire to live independently from one another. From your mind, given the competing interests, what would a healthy US-China relationship look like in an era of AI? What should we be striving for? And then let's back up to some of the issues of the day.
Well, the first thing I would say is the most difficult chapter in the whole book to write for us was the chapter about China. It's so important. And one of our great fears is that, especially in Washington, D.C., but potentially in Beijing, people can lose sight of nuance. And certainly in the technology relationship between the United States and China, the nuances matter, the details matter. And we try to bring to life all the texture that goes into this technology relationship, including, frankly, deep historical, philosophical differences that nonetheless I think need to be understood and appreciated. I think a better arrangement 2 or 5 years from now or sooner would, of course, resolve some of the market access and trade and tariff issues so that those become at least at a lower temperature. I think we have to recognize the reality that the two nations will look at the role and regulation of technology in different ways. I don't think we can expect a single convergence. But by the same token, if there's one thing that we are seeking to warn against, it's an effort to, as we say, draw a digital iron curtain down the middle of the Pacific. We really think it's of fundamental importance for policymakers, perhaps most especially in Washington, D.C., to just understand the world of technology and in particular software development. That if you buy a product from an American tech company, you of course may expect, if you think about it, that the hardware was manufactured in China. But in fact, the basic features, including of the software, probably came together from inventors not just in this region or Seattle or Boston, but in Bangalore and Beijing and Dublin and London and on a global basis. They are advances that really are founded in part on hugely important work in the field of basic research at universities. It's work that's typically published. It is often source code that is made available in open source form. And so if we're going to get the details of this technology relationship right, we have to appreciate these nuances. And I think above all else, as we're thinking about a new generation of potential export controls for American technology, whether it's forms of AI or quantum computing or others, we really have to remember that if we created a wall, we might well do more to hold ourselves back than the people who live on the other side.
And once again, since I know you love playing odds makers, I mean, it seems that's the direction both sides seem to want to head from a government perspective, is to this sort of digital wall, this winner-take-all competition for AI, this notion that China should develop its own parallel software and chip industry. You know, we need to not manufacture stuff in China. How likely do you see that being the future versus the one that you've expressed a desire for, where, you know, products are made in the US and China and lots of other places, and goods and ideas and technology contribute? Which is the more likely outcome?
Well, I will readily concede in this context that when you look at the fundamental geopolitical forces in the world, they are not blowing in favor of this kind of international interaction. And you know, this is obviously true in our own country. It's true in a number of countries in Europe and around the world. And you know, one of the parallels we draw in our book is the parallels that we sometimes see between today and some of the issues, say, in the early 1930s.
So I have tons more questions on these and other subjects, but I want to open it up to you all first. If for some reason there's a shy Churchill Club crowd, which I have never met, we'll get back to some more of mine, but I want to give you all a chance. So there are Churchill folks with microphones. I'm going to ask a couple things. Speak close to the mic. Make sure it's a question and a succinct one at that. Say who you are and where you work. And I think that's it. So I have a question back there.
Yeah, my name's Mark Locke, and I'm with Laugh Tears at Venice Beach, California. And thank you very much, Brett, for your book and talking about that nobody should be above the law, and no corporation should be either. And my question is, if an employee has evidence of illegal or unethical practices, is that employee bound to become, duty-bound to become a whistleblower?
First of all, I think it's a really good question. Certainly what we try to encourage, and I don't think we're different from other companies when I think about what we do at Microsoft, we profoundly want our employees who see something of concern to bring it to our attention so we can fix it. We've launched a broad campaign over the last several years internally that we call Microsoft Runs on Trust. And frankly, it's all about encouraging our employees to use a wide variety of different vehicles to elevate their concerns. And we even have what I will argue is, if not the world's best, at least the world's most entertaining, as well as among the world's best training videos. We do it every summer. People inside Microsoft consider it like the Netflix of training, because we really try to connect with employees.
Hey, it's Microsoft's first successful entertainment service.
It's taken a long time, but the lawyers got it right. That to me is the duty that people have. Now, if people raise a concern and they feel they have an employer that isn't listening or listens and is refusing to take action, then there are a wide variety of situations where someone might well feel that they should take that information beyond the walls of a company, and I think one has to respect their judgment. Certain people actually do have a duty in the formal sense of a word. I'll speak as a lawyer for a moment. If a lawyer at a company sees certain types of action that would constitute securities fraud and raises it up the chain and it doesn't get addressed, then actually lawyers in certain instances do have a duty even under the law. I think for most people, It's more of a sense of moral responsibility, and I think one has to be respectful of that.
Thanks. We're going to have, I see some questions up front. There are folks with mics, so I'm going to go first to the mic, and then hopefully they'll make it up front as well.
Hi, my name is Emily Wawrowski. I'm a student at the Stanford International Policy Program, and thank you so much for this talk. I'm really excited to be here. I have a concrete question. So AI is biased, but not because the computer is horribly biased, but because it's being fed very specific types of data and data set that are biased. So I have a question for you, as somebody who has thought about this a lot. What would be a concrete suggestion for a policymaker if you were able to implement it regardless of political repercussions? How would you legislate bias in technology?
We have a particular legislative proposal that I am personally very passionate about and excited about, and I hope we can get it adopted somewhere soon. It really starts with the premise that customers don't actually want to buy a facial recognition service that's biased. That is not an attractive feature for customers. So I would argue that the market has a natural incentive to push tech companies to reduce bias quickly. But the market can only work if it has access to information. And so what we've proposed is that a major jurisdiction, it doesn't need to be the world, it can be a country of some size or a state of some size, pass a law that would say that if you want to be in the business of offering a facial recognition service, you must make your service available for testing. And it could be done in a couple of different ways. But in effect, that would enable academic testing. It would enable the consumer reports of facial recognition to emerge. And then the marketplace would have more information. You would get objective tests that would compare everybody's results. And I think that if you did this is where I'm an optimist, I think that over the course of 2 or 3 years, you would see a rising tide lift all boats because people would really feel the market pressure to solve this problem more quickly. And then I would add, and if it doesn't, then 2 years from now, legislators, regulators could say, okay, well, that didn't do enough. Now I have to do something else beyond it. But I would start there and see what the market can deliver.
And I know someone's there with a question. Great.
Carl Hewitt, Emeritus of MIT. How should the United States think about a company like Huawei, and what should we do about it?
Great, that was on my list of questions I didn't get to.
They ask me, I have Chinese colleagues, they say, what should we think about a company like Intel, and what should we do about it?
Well, I like the fact that you generalized it a bit, because it is not a question that people ask only about one company from China. They also ask it about companies from the United States. And by the way, you can go to Europe and people will ask this about companies from both China and the United States. And I would say a couple of things. I mean, first, by definition, there are going to be parts of our societal technological infrastructure that are more sensitive from an economic or national security perspective. And I think it is sensible that governments think about what kinds of precautions or rules they want to put in place to protect the security of that infrastructure. The second thing I would say is, of course, the nationality of suppliers is one way to address that. You might have certain technologies that are so sensitive that the NATO allies might say they only want to procure it from companies headquartered in NATO countries, or at least implemented in the hardware and products of NATO countries. But the third thing I would say is that, like a lot of debates, focus on one thing can distract us from other things. A government or a country could buy local technology and still wake up one morning and find that it's very insecure. There's a lot more to the security of technology, as I think almost everybody in this room appreciates, than the location or nationality of the supplier. We at Microsoft have had to work with this on a global basis for well more than 15 years around a product like Windows. We've had many governments over the years say, gee, I wonder, can I trust this product? It comes from the United States. How do I know that there's no back door in it? And we say, well, there's not. And they say, well, that's very nice. Why should I take you at your word? And so, what we've created is transparency centers where governments under controlled and secure conditions can go in and inspect our source code and with the right team of government engineers satisfy themselves about the nature of the code. And so what I would really say is that we'd all benefit in this country and more broadly from a more robust discussion of the variety of tools that exist to protect the security of technology. And it doesn't mean that nationality becomes irrelevant, but it does mean that there are more tools that should be considered than nationality alone.
Thanks. I think I saw a question right here. Yeah.
So, Pushkar Apte from UC Berkeley. First of all, I want to say thank you for all the enlightening stories you told. I'm a technologist, and I didn't know half of these things were happening, and they were in our industry. So thank you very much. One thing that I found particularly inspiring was this Christchurch call for action, which I have to say I was completely ignorant of. My question is that in situations like this where sometimes governments are not acting as strongly as they should, and the specific question that I have is about climate change, which I think is an existentialist threat for all of us. We have only one planet, as far as we know, right? Do you think that tech companies can play a bigger role than they are playing right now? Or should they be stepping up to the plate? And I realize it's not primarily a corporate responsibility, but actually filling the vacuum that certain governments are creating.
Well, it's not a book, an issue that we discuss in detail. We do talk about it a little bit, and my fundamental answer to your question is yes. I do think that the science is there, and the United Nations report last year in particular showed that we need to address the climate issues with greater urgency, and we have less time in particular to prevent an increase in the rise of temperature. So then the question is, what should we do? Look, I'm not here to advocate for what everybody should do. I'm certainly happy to share what we've concluded is right for us at Microsoft as a company. The first thing we did, frankly, in response to the UN study from last year was raise the price of our internal carbon tax. This is a tax that we impose on every part of the company on the use of carbon, which fundamentally goes to our data centers. That's far and away the biggest use of carbon. But second, it's our campuses, our buildings, and third, it's our employee travel. And we raised that from $8.44 a metric ton to $15 a metric ton. That went in force in July of this year. And I believe it's likely, based on the conversations that we've had, that we will continue to raise the price on ourselves. We think it is helpful and important for us in creating the right economic incentives across the company to reduce carbon use more rapidly, and it raises money that we're then able to apply for various carbon-related initiatives. The second thing that we've felt very good about is one of the ways we've spent that money, and that's to create a program we call AI for Earth. And it really focuses on 4 areas. It focuses on carbon reduction, biodiversity, water, and agriculture. And so we currently are working with a $50 million 5-year commitment where we provide initially seed capital to universities, nonprofits, startups, specifically about how to use AI to address challenges in these 4 areas. We're the only tech company that I know of that has a team that consists of both environmental scientists and computer and data scientists internally. So what we really try to do is bring our collective AI expertise to organizations that have great expertise on environmental issues. And our goal is to continue to see what emerges and then make bigger investments in technologies that can take off, sort of classic Silicon Valley thinking. And I'm hopeful that as we raise funding from our internal tax, that is one of the big things that we can do. The last thing I will say is we find today, in a way that just wasn't there 2 years ago, maybe even 1 year ago, a real desire by customers around the world. Companies want to do more. And part of what they really want to do more of is figure out how to use technology to reduce their own impact on climate. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of good that can come from this. I mean, but the real challenge is we're now increasingly in a race against time. And there's two ways to describe the challenge. It's either about saving the planet or about saving humanity. I would bet on the planet recovering before humanity. And it's something for the sake of ourselves and our children and our grandchildren, we really need to address with a sense of urgency.
I think we have time for one more quick question.
Question here.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Larry Macenter, and I'm an independent researcher. My concern is around software that always updates. No, not the update, but the problem is that used to be when you bought a car, you bought the car and you could evaluate its safety features, and you would decide you liked the car, you trusted it, or you didn't. Now you buy a car and it gets over-the-air updates every few months or weeks. Every piece of software that we have updates itself automatically, and the trust relationship has changed because you have to trust not only the original source, but all of the updates forever.
I mean, how much does this matter? Everything also, in the context of this, has more code in it. So it's your TV, it's your internal security. All these things are now software. Software has eaten the world. Is this a big concern?
I think it is an important issue. And I'd first say, I don't think software has eaten the world, but the world is eating a lot of software. That's really what's happening. Every one of us as consumers, every institution that we work for is, in effect, eating software every day. Now, the first thing I would say is, in my opinion, the one thing that's worse than software that doesn't update itself, the one thing that's worse than software that does update itself is software that doesn't. Because that's where you see the cybersecurity threats grow and the security of the software itself doesn't keep pace. So I would at least argue that we need a world where software is updated on an almost continuous basis. But I nonetheless think that the points that you raise are really of great significance. First of all, it just raises huge issues around quality control, since things can move so quickly from an improvement in changing the code to the deployment of that code literally on a global basis. Second, it really does mean, as I think you're right to point out, the maintenance of this trust relationship so that only trusted code is actually making it out to the various devices on which it will be deployed. And third, by definition, what that also means is we need to be more focused than ever before on any potential to interfere or disrupt that process. One of the things that we talk about at some length in the book is the lessons from the WannaCry and NotPetya attacks in 2017. And we think there's actually a lot more to be learned from what the world experienced on those two dates in May and June 2017 than what we've talked about as a society so far. But the time to have this conversation is now. Where we're going to be living in a world where software is updating cars that are driving themselves down the road. The potential risks you create if you don't have a trusted process is just enormous. That's just a long way of saying that we need this updating to make the world work, but we have real issues that deserve much more attention than they're receiving.
All right, well, we are going to let you go. I know you have to catch a plane, but in closing, we have two things. One, we're big believers in smart brevity at Axios, but actually Daniel has taken this a step further than even we've gone, and they're asking people as part of their one-word initiative, you were asked to write down one word of advice for an aspiring entrepreneur. Can you share that one word of advice and a little bit quickly the story behind it? And I think you have it to show us.
Somebody took it away from me. Oh, it's underneath. I do have it to show. I wrote the word humility. I have a saying that I love to use across Microsoft. Nobody ever died of humility. You have bad days. It's not the worst thing in the world to be humble because it forces you to acknowledge your mistakes and to learn. And I actually think that it's what I've learned from Satya Nadella. I think Microsoft is in part a little bit of a story of success, and then the world forced it to become humble. And out of that humility came a little bit of redemption in terms of a broader-minded approach to working with the world.
Great. And then from the Churchill Club, we've covered a lot of ground tonight. We've had a really wide-ranging conversations, definitely a lot to think about. If we were sitting down and having this conversation 3 to 5 years from now, what do you hope would have changed? What sort of conversation do you hope we'll be having? What sort of conversation do you think we'll be having 3 to 5 years from now?
The conversation I hope we will be having is about the progress we're making as an industry, in collaboration with governments and nonprofits around the world, in making real strides. Looking back at 2019 and saying, you know what, we had the Paris call, we had the Christchurch call, now we have efforts around the world on many issues, and people are looking at the tech sector with an appreciation of at least the work we're pursuing to solve problems that bother them. I am optimistic enough to say that in part that should be the conversation we're having in 5 years. But what I'll also predict is that we'll be talking about many more controversies and issues around artificial intelligence. I think facial recognition was in some ways the opening issue around the ethical and human rights issues associated with AI. I think lethal autonomous weapons are a second. I think we're going to see ourselves increasingly debating the role of algorithms and social media and the like. I think that 5 years from now, there will be somebody who shows up with a book that has the 15 chapters about the 15 controversies that have emerged around artificial intelligence, because it's just such a widespread and important technology with such a broad impact on the world that it's almost inevitable that there will be more questions, not fewer, 5 years from now.
Well, if you didn't know why I was so excited before we began this conversation to talk with Brad Smith about all this, I hope you do now. If you want more from Brad, there's really good news. Everyone has his book, and I encourage you to read it. If you want more from me, I do a daily newsletter for Axios called Login. Thank you so much, Brad, for a great conversation.
No, thanks to all of you. Thank you very much.
One last little thing for you two here, please. We have a gift for you. Both Churchill Club and Computer History Museum have a small gift for you as a token of our appreciation. Thank you so much for this candid conversation, Brad, Ina, for leading it so well. Thank you. You've been a great audience. Now, I do want to say that Ina has offered 1 or 2 of her free newsletters to you if you're interested. And this is how you can ask for that. You can either go and create a login for yourself. You can also write yes on the back of your business card and hand it to any Churchill staff person. Or you can write to Ina at axios.com. Thank you so much. You've been a wonderful audience. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Ina.